Kursk was taking part in a naval exercise in the Arctic waters of the Barents Sea north of Norway when disaster struck.
During the Cold War, there was an intense arms race between Western countries, led primarily by the United States and the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics, also known as the USSR or Soviet Union. The U.S. fleet of aircraft carriers posed a significant threat to the USSR, due in part to their ability to conduct nuclear strikes and detect nuclear submarines. In response to this threat, and the need to combat the U.S. aircraft carriers, the USSR began producing powerful nuclear submarines. One of these submarines was the Oscar II class, referred to by NATO as Oscar II, designed specifically to take down the threat of aircraft carriers. These submarines were powered by nuclear reactors, granting them an impressive top speed of approximately 33 knots when submerged. While their speed was notable, submarine operations often prioritized stealth and evasion rather than directly keeping pace with aircraft carriers. The submarines were substantial ships, with a length of about 154 meters. This is comparable to about 2 turbojets. In the huge hull, they could carry a load of 24 P-700 Granite missiles. These missiles were about 33 feet long and weighed 15,400 pounds each. The P-700 Granite missiles were equipped with enough explosive power to destroy naval vessels, including aircraft carriers. One of these submarines, K-141, was called the Kursk. The name was derived from the historic Battle of Kursk in 1943 during World War II, due to its size and its robust construction. The Kursk, like HMS Titanic, was considered unsinkable. Its outer hull was built using 8.5mm steel plating covered with thick rubber. The internal pressure hull was also made with 50mm steel plating. The engineers claimed that Kursk could withstand a direct torpedo hit. Construction of Kursk was completed in 1994, and it was assigned to the Russian Northern Fleet. Over the weekend of August 12th and August 13th in 2000, the Kursk was on a naval training exercise in the Barents Sea. It ventured out to sea under the watchful eye of Gennady Petrovich Lyakin, the commanding officer on board. The 45-year-old had joined the Navy 28 years earlier. He was promoted to captain first rank in 1996. Joining them on the training exercise were other vessels of the Northern Fleet, including the aircraft carrier Admiral Kuznetsov and battlecruiser Pyotr Velikite. With the Kursk armed with Granite missiles and torpedoes, the exercise was to simulate an attack on the aircraft carrier. The crew of the Kursk was considered the best in the fleet. Led by Gennady Lyakin and with 118 crew on board, Kursk was in good hands. But during the exercise, the first major Russian training mission since the collapse of the Soviet Union, something went horribly wrong. At 8:51 a.m. on August 12, 2000, the Kursk submarine was preparing to launch a torpedo. Permission to proceed was requested, and at 11:29 a.m., the crew began loading the first dummy torpedo. But seconds later, disaster struck. A catastrophic detonation occurred in one of the torpedo tubes, leading to a massive explosion. The explosion was attributed to a faulty practice torpedo, and it resulted in the release of hydrogen peroxide, which mixed with the torpedo's kerosene and caused the devastating blast. Hydrogen peroxide, known for its volatility, had been banned by the British Navy due to its potential for combustion. The explosion rocked the Pyotr Velikite battlecruiser on the surface and was picked up on seismic detectors as a 1.5 on the Richter scale. The damage caused by the submarine was catastrophic. A fireball destroyed the first and second compartments of the submarine. Everyone in the control room was lost. The fire caused a second explosion as it ignited the remaining torpedoes on board. With the first 2 compartments destroyed in the initial blast, personnel who were farther back likely survived. But when the second explosion rocked the sub, 2 minutes and 15 seconds later, it destroyed the bulkheads forward of compartment 6 and everyone in them. One torpedo, specifically a Type 65-76A, a super heavy torpedo, caused a deep crack in the side of the submarine, causing it to sink to a depth of 354 feet on the seabed of the Barents Sea. The torpedo descended at a 20-degree angle before hitting the seabed. Fortunately, the nuclear reactors were safely shut down, so no nuclear waste was released into the ocean. Most of the crew had been lost to the explosions, but 23 managed to escape to the rear compartment. They had avoided the fire and the explosions, but they had no way to get to the surface. Nearby vessels, including Western submarines who were reportedly patrolling the seas at the time, picked up tapping noises on their radars. This tapping went on for 3 days. Some dismissed the noises as sounds created by collapsing equipment or the submarine settling on the seabed and filling with water. But with no radio contact, the 23 survivors were still fighting for their lives. They needed a way to communicate with the outside world. Bashing metal on metal was one way to achieve that. As news of the tragedy spread, Russia downplayed the extent of the incident. U.S. National Security Advisor Sandy Berger and Defense Secretary William Cohen were informed of the disaster by intelligence before the Kremlin was even made aware. Western countries including the U.S., Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Israel, and Norway offered to help in the rescue efforts, but Russia declined. Instead, they were intent on rescuing their own men themselves. A nearby Russian submarine had detected the explosions, but assumed they were part of the military exercise. When the battlecruiser Pyotr Veliky reported an expected explosion as their hull shook, fleet headquarters dismissed their fears. When the Kursk failed to communicate following the end of their scheduled training exercise, Fleet Commander Admiral Popov on board the battlecruiser was not initially concerned. Communication failures between surface vessels and submarines were common. It wasn't until 6 hours after the initial explosion that a search and rescue operation was launched. The Kursk didn't respond to communication attempts, and flybys hadn't located them at the surface. The rest of the Northern Fleet now realized that the Kursk crew were in trouble, and that they remained underwater in the Barents Sea. 3,000 sailors joined in the search for their missing comrades. Locating the distressed submarine was proving difficult for the Russians. The crew that had been in the control room had been incapacitated by the blasts, likely no longer alive. The emergency rescue buoy had been disabled. The purpose of this buoy was to release when environmental conditions inside the sub were changed by the likes of fire or pressure. It would float to the surface and signal the submarine's position. However, upon later inspection, investigators found that the buoy had been disabled during an earlier expedition. The Kursk had been spying on U.S. naval ships in the Mediterranean. At the time, the Russians were worried the buoy may be accidentally triggered, giving their position away to the U.S. When the Kursk began its training exercise, the rescue buoy was never re-enabled. Eventually, the Russian deep submergence rescue vehicle AS-34 was deployed as part of the rescue operation. While it managed to reach the wreck of the Kursk, it faced difficulties attaching to the submarine. Running low on power, it couldn't establish a proper seal over the escape hatch. With the batteries running out and no spare batteries available, the rescue crew had to wait for the batteries to recharge. The Russian government faced mounting pressure from the families of those on board the Kursk submarine to provide details about the situation. Initially, they downplayed the severity of the incident, describing it as minor difficulties and suggesting that the submarine was resting on the seafloor. They made false statements to the media and the sailors' loved ones, asserting that they were in communication with those on board and providing essential support like air and power. These deceptive statements raised false hopes, as the actual situation was far more critical. During the 4 days following the accident, the Russian Navy made several unsuccessful attempts to attach diving bells to the escape hatch. It wasn't until 5 days later that Russian President Vladimir Putin finally and reluctantly accepted international help. However, the burning question remained: would the aid arrive in time to rescue the remaining 23 servicemen? It took just 2 days for British and Norwegian rescue divers to open the hatch into the 9th compartment, but it was too late. The 23 men in the rear section had already passed away. But what had happened to them? These men had a different story to tell. Lieutenant Captain Dmitry Koselnikov, one of the officers on board Kursk, made it to the rear compartment with 22 other crew members. He was 27 years old and was among the 3 officers of his rank. It appeared that he took charge during the crisis. He held the position of head of the turbine unit in the 7th compartment. With him in the 9th rear compartment was Alexei Nekrasov, who at 19 was the youngest crew member on board. All power had gone out. There was no light. The crew fumbled around in the dark. As the hours ticked by, they would have been able to feel the oxygen levels dropping. They didn't have much time left. Feelings of lightheadedness and breathlessness are all signs of depleted oxygen and a buildup of carbon dioxide. During that desperate time, Lieutenant Captain Koselnikov wrote a note. Knowing that he wasn't going to make it, on one side of the piece of paper he wrote a goodbye letter to his wife Olga. They had only been married a few months and were looking forward to spending the rest of their lives together. Olga said she thought her husband had a premonition of passing away on duty. When he said goodbye to her before setting sail, he handed her his dog tag and his crucifix. On the other side of the paper, he detailed the events as they unfolded, apparently for the benefit of the Navy should they ever find it. Using the illuminated hands on his wristwatch, he was able to confirm the time at which he was writing, which was several hours after the initial explosion. All personnel from Section 6, 7, and 8 have been moved to Section 9. There are 23 of us here. We have made this decision because none of us can escape, the note states. I am writing blind, Koselnikov wrote. He justified the actions of the 23 men who had abandoned their compartments when disaster struck and rushed to the rear section. This was against protocol, but the seriousness of the accident meant that they knew none of their colleagues in the fore could be saved. Above them in the rear section was the only aft escape hatch. 2 or 3 of his comrades planned to escape through there, but when this attempt failed, they resigned to their fate. It was not clear why the men could not escape through the hatch. They had diving equipment for such an emergency, and the hatch was built specifically for that purpose. Mr. Igor Spassky, one of the design engineers for the Kursk, said that the hatch may have been damaged or failed to open. Others speculated that the remaining survivors may have been injured or unable to attempt escape. The crew had access to rescue hoods which completely covered the wearer's head in a pocket of air. This reduced the likelihood of suffering from decompression sickness as they rose to the surface. However, they were in the middle of the Arctic Circle. Swimming to the surface in the icy water could have proved fatal. They were probably hopeful of a rescue mission and waiting for the sound of a rescue vessel latching onto the hatch. As they were in the middle of a large naval exercise, they would have assumed rescue had been launched immediately. But they were wrong. As oxygen levels ran low, anoxia set in. But there was evidence that they fought to the bitter end. Upon forensic examination of the vessel when it was hauled onto dry land a year later, investigators found many potassium superoxide chemical oxygen cartridges in the compartment. These absorb carbon dioxide and generate oxygen. In the darkness, it was a difficult task to recharge the oxygen generation system. This was made even harder by their probable inability to think clearly as their brains were starved of oxygen. Tragically, one of the cartridges was dropped into the oily water that was slowly filling the compartment. When it made contact, it instantly combusted, triggering a chemical explosion and flash fire. Severe chemical burns on Lieutenant Captain Koselnikov and 2 others suggest this is how they lost their lives. Others immediately ducked below the waist-high water to avoid being burned, but as the flames roared, the last remaining oxygen was used up. When they resurfaced, those that were left quickly succumbed to anoxia. When rescue divers opened the escape hatch and pulled Lieutenant Captain Koselnikov from the vessel, the note he had written was found folded in his shirt pocket. They found a small air pocket remaining in the compartment, which contained just 7% oxygen. The Russian government tried to cover up the fact that some men had survived the initial blasts. There was some peace for families knowing that their loved ones fell instantly. This disaster was the first real test for new President Vladimir Putin. He had only taken office earlier that year, and his response was widely criticized. At the time of the disaster, he was on holiday in Sochi, but instead of rushing back to Moscow to show his support for the victims' families, he continued his vacation. One mother spoke out about her anger at the Kremlin for their handling of the crisis. Her son, Sergei Vachenko, who was just 20 years old, was the least experienced person on board. She had begged him not to sign up, but he was duty-bound to serve his country. When he found out that he was going to be serving on Russia's most sophisticated submarine, he was delighted. In his last letter home to his mother, he spoke of his initiation before becoming a true submariner. This involved drinking a glass of seawater and kissing a greased ship's hammer before shaking the commander's hand. He was proud to have been the submarine's junior cook, a promotion from the cargo room. His mother was devastated to find out about her son's demise on the television. No military official had contacted her to let her know what had happened. Her colleagues scraped together funds for her to travel to the relatives' vigil in a military town called Vidyayevo. This was home to the Kursk command. There was no military support for the families. She said that President Putin should have been sent to the bottom of the sea and left there. Then he would understand what the Kursk's crew went through. In her words, "People get punished when they betray their country. But what if a country betrays its people?" Another mother spoke of her devastation to learn that her son, Alexei Nekrasov, the youngest sailor on board, had survived beyond the initial blast. Knowing that he had been waiting for rescue and that it never came was heartbreaking. When criticisms of the Kremlin were made public, Putin agreed to meet with the families of the crew. It was an emotional meeting. One mother of a young crewman was forcibly sedated as she yelled accusations at Putin and demanded answers. She was carried out of the room. During the meeting, Putin promised to retrieve the bodies from the sub. It was a dangerous task. Divers and robotics were used to cut through the submarine's 2-inch thick steel exterior. Putin admitted a year later that he should have returned to Moscow. He said that his act of returning wouldn't have changed the outcome. He was in constant communication from his home in Sochi, but returning would have been perceived as the right thing to do by the media, the public, and the families of those involved. Speculation about what might have sunk Russia's unsinkable submarine raged. The government blamed a faulty weld in the practice torpedo's casing. This allowed the hydrogen peroxide to leak out. Manufacturers of the torpedo denied these claims. Others blamed inadequate training, incompetent men, or poor equipment. The government were trying to conceal the fact that their elite naval crew were inadequate. In the salvaged wreckage, a manual was found giving instructions on how to load and fire the torpedoes, but the instructions were for an entirely different type of torpedo. Essential preparation steps that should have been followed for the Kursk's torpedoes were missing. Nobody had checked whether the crew were qualified or knowledgeable on how to operate the Kursk's weaponry. The crew hadn't fired any torpedoes for at least 3 years. Further failures to operate the torpedo were also found during the forensic inspection. The inner tube that the torpedo sits in was built to withstand tremendous force. If the torpedo exploded internally, it would be propelled out to sea. However, evidence was found that suggested the inner tube door hadn't been sealed properly. This would result in a catastrophic explosion inside the submarine. Despite the answers found by the investigative crew, Russia was reluctant to admit that their naval crew and equipment were at fault. Instead, they pointed the finger elsewhere. Some senior officials put forward the idea that a World War II mine had been accidentally hit and detonated. Others claimed it had been their own fire, such as a missile launched from the surface battlecruiser, whilst others claimed that the disaster was caused by the West. The commander of Russia's Northern Fleet was adamant that a NATO submarine had collided with the Kursk. He suggested that both USS Memphis and Toledo were monitoring the Russians' training exercise, and one of them came too close. The evidence that the Russians had of this were photos of the US submarine Memphis docked at a Norwegian naval base. Although the photo couldn't be verified, they claimed the Memphis was in dock for repairs following the collision. The Russian public, who disliked the West, readily accepted these claims. It seemed true that 2 American submarines were spying on the Russian exercise. There had also been previous incidents of American and Russian subs colliding with one another in the Barents Sea, so the Russians' claims weren't entirely unfounded. But the evidence by the investigation team pointed towards an explosion, not a collision. And it seems the Russians agreed a couple of years later when they removed all torpedoes powered by hydrogen peroxide from their submarines. The families of the victims were offered compensation to the sum of $20,000. It was the first time the Russian government had compensated people for a tragedy. President Putin awarded the entire crew the Order of Courage for selfless acts of courage and valor posthumously. He also awarded the submarine's captain, Gennady Layakin, the title Hero of the Russian Federation. The Russian Navy, in the handling of its response to this disaster, were seen as slow and inadequate. The country's leader, Vladimir Putin, was initially seen as callous and cold towards the families of the victims, and the unsinkable submarine and its crew showed flaws in the Russian military. It was a disaster that could have been avoided, but the question still remains: could some of the crew have been saved had the Russians not been too proud to ask for help? Thanks for watching this story. Don't forget to like and subscribe and turn on your notification bell to stay updated on more similar videos. We would love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share your comments below. Until next time.